And then throughout the book of Mark, what Mark is going to do is show the things that Jesus did and why he's God. So Jesus walks on the water. Well, to the Old Testament Jews, who's the one who can walk on the water? Just Yahweh. He does it in Job 9. He's the one who can tread the seas. Jesus has the ability to calm the wind and the waves, right? Obviously, that seems like a godlike attribute just in general to be able to control the weather. But it's significant because in the Old Testament, it was the idea that the sea represented chaos. And the only one who had the power to bring order to chaos is Yahweh.
Coley, welcome to the show.
How's it going?
Very well, my friend. You were recently featured on the Jubilee Channel, which is a very well-known YouTube channel. You were crossing swords with famous atheist and agnostic Alex O'Connor. For those who don't know, what is Jubilee and what is its format?
Yeah. Jubilee is a YouTube platform, like you said, extremely popular. And really, they just create an open dialogue for just two opposing sides a lot of the times to just kind of go at it and see what happens. And so the Jubilee experience I was on was one atheist versus 25 Christians in a series they do called Surrounded. And so it seems to be a very popular series at the moment. And they ended up reaching out to me to be on it. And I debated Alex O'Connor on whether or not Jesus claimed to be God. So really fun.
Why did they reach out to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. They found my TikTok. And I just do apologetics on there. And I don't know what made me appealing. I mean, I have somewhat of a following, but there's a lot of people, with a lot of accounts. And I know even like a very popular guy over here named Trent Horn. He like kind of reviewed the debate and he wanted to go on it and they didn't pick him. So I'm like, he's probably better than me. But they reached out to me via Instagram, but they saw me on TikTok and interviewed a couple times. They liked me. And so I got to be a part of the experience.
So you say you make apologetic TikToks.
Yeah.
And what topics and what are you covering in that?
I actually typically, I guess what I'm most fascinated with is people who have the popular term is deconstructed from the faith. So it's people who say that they were Christians at one time. There's kind of some theological debate on, if you can lose your salvation or whatnot. But, they say they grew up in the church. They say that they're Christians and then they've left the faith. And typically they'll make videos of things that they have problems with in Christianity or why they left the faith. And what I like to do is I'll just kind of play a clip from them and then I'll just respond to it and maybe deal with some of their objections.
On Jubilee, you crossed verbal swords with Alex when he proposed that Jesus didn't claim to be God. In doing so, he excluded the Book of John, given the scholarly consensus that it's at least historically accurate. What do you make of that claim?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think a lot of it is rooted in kind of the Bart Ehrman camp. He's a scholar. He's an atheist scholar. He's a guy that Alex had on his podcast. And Alex, the reason why I say that is because he regurgitated some of the things that him and Bart Ehrman discussed on their podcast, on his podcast together. And my initial, for anyone who hasn't seen the format, you basically go in the circle. You have to race to get to the middle, and then you get to talk until the circle votes you out. So it's not as a long form content as you would like, a long form discussion. My retort to it would be, even if the Gospel of John didn't exist, all of the early Christians would have thought Jesus claimed to be God. It's significant and important. And there's some things that we may learn about Jesus, some stories that are there, but you don't need the Gospel of John in order to understand that Jesus is claiming to be God. So that's like the funny part of it. You could just grant it just for the sake of the argument and go, oh, okay, still claiming to be God in the other Gospels. So, but I have this, actually, I have a book here, for anyone who sees this visually, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. incredible book. And this is a scholarly work. It's thick, and a lot of it is spent. It's all spent on all the Gospels, eyewitness accounts, and a lot of it is spent on the Book of John and why it's actually reliable. So there is scholarly work and evidence done on why John is a credible account of Jesus's life.
So you alluded to a bit about the format of Jubilee. Did you find it frustrating, the voting out system, or is it all just part of the cut and thrust of the format?
Yeah, it's part of the cut and thrust. Some guy, I like that term. Some people did find it frustrating. I think I just had the expectation going in, like, hey, this is just what it is, and I'll be blessed to honestly get 4 or 5 minutes of talking with this guy, and I did, right? So I won't go into like all the production, and I have the full experience of what really happened. And some things are different in reality than how it plays out. And so I won't go, much into that, but I will say one thing that is unique, and this shouldn't be that surprising. There's 4 different segments, and they shifted them around. And so I was actually the very first person to debate Alex. Whereas if you watch the video, it actually seems like I'm on the near the end. So
Interesting. Why do you think they shifted it like?
I don't know. I mean, I think it made sense for the shift as I watched the video. I think they're a great production company, and I think that I'll tell you this. I'll put it like this. I felt pretty rough coming out of that. Like, oh my gosh, it really feels like Alex just cooked the majority of people in the circle. And in some ways he did. And it's 25 Christians. Some of us were prepared, right? Some of us are prepared for a conversation like that. Some, they just applied. They just came on. They don't even and it's really tough to be put in that situation. And so I think they actually did a great job of putting it together to making it flow well. So I'm not like mad about it or anything. Yeah.
As a wholesale term, Alex's performance, obviously he's pretty much as close to a professional debater as you can get. Very eloquent, very erudite. As a performance as a whole, considering he was on the offensive pretty much for an hour and a half or whatever it is, how would you rate his performance? We haven't seen it firsthand.
Yeah. So I'll say this with all respect. He could have done better. Like I'll put it like that. I think some of his arguments hold up in the video because there's not enough time to press it, if that makes sense. Like some of the arguments that he presented, even like around suffering and kind of how he presents the claim and then what he actually goes into, I don't think is actually that great. And it kind of makes sense. So we ended up going to dinner with Alex afterwards. And he just happened to sit across the table from me. There was, probably like 10 of us that went to dinner with him, and he rode in the car with me and a couple guys. So we basically debriefed the whole thing with him. Right. And even he was like, man, it's a tough format. Like, it's a lot of fun. It's super entertaining. Like, I'm not knocking Jubilee. I think it's amazing. I was so excited to go on it, but it is a tough format to actually draw out, some of these discussions. And so because of that, I don't even think Alex was able to bring his A game, if that makes sense, because he in some ways is just as limited as the rest of us. Because every time he's getting a conversation going, then it cuts off for him too. So
if we go back to what you and him were talking about, whether or not Jesus actually claimed to be God. One thing he did mention when citing other sources which weren't the gospel was a source called Q.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
Yeah, so Q is this idea. It's just a theory, technically, because we don't have Q, that it's another first century source that the Gospels are drawing from. So I think most scholars would agree that maybe like Matthew and Luke, since it's considered that they're written after Mark, that they're being drawn from Mark, that they had Mark and they were expounding on Mark. And they're called the synoptic gospels for a reason. They're very synonymous in the way that they're written. But the idea is that there's another source out there called Q that was helping develop just the consistency of the gospel. Some, I think, even throw in possibly another source. But, whether Q exists or not feels irrelevant because I don't have it. It's like, okay, like it's just a theory. Like it's kind of mind-boggling to me that some of these scholars would really kind of hold fast that this other source exists, and maybe it probably does, right? Like maybe it's more likely than it does than not. But because we don't have it, it's like it's so irrelevant to me. It's like, okay, like I can't do anything about Q because I like that it doesn't exist anymore if it ever did. So
what do we know about Q other than that we think it might inform other gospels, etc.?
yeah, because I'm not that interested in Q, I actually that's like the extent of my knowledge of Q. So like I don't even know why they named it Q. Yeah, because the moment I learned about Q and realized like, well, it doesn't exist. Like you can't access it. So I was like, I guess I'm not gonna. Nobody knows more about Q, right? Like because nobody has it, and so like I don't know how much more you can find about it. I'm sure somebody's run their doctorate on Q, but yeah.
So for those who haven't seen the video, we've already laid out that Alex then was disregarding John in a scholarly way. What was then his proposal, and then what was your debate on his proposal?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm in hindsight, and I've watched it back, so I'm probably gonna give a clearer picture and understanding of it now than I even had in the moment. Right in the moment, I'm the very first person. It's high pressure. Like I know that I could get voted out at any time. So even taking in the information that he's giving me, like as I watched it back, I was like, I like I was more impressed with myself than like it's so hard to even kind of, and I think people like don't people, it's easy to forget that when you're watching it, right? It's like, hey, this is actually really difficult. And so his argument, and this is where it kind of is based out of Bart Ehrman and really kind of critical scholarship, is that the Jesus of the Bible, of the New Testament, of particularly the Gospels, is different than the historical Jesus. Basically, and I know like I think that might sound weird to some people, because the historical Jesus in essence is kind of a made up person. And what I mean by that is all of our sources of who we know Jesus to be and what he said is in the Gospels. And I got Alex to admit that, but critical scholarship would say, but the real Jesus was different than that person. The problem is there's no competing sources or evidence to show that. If you get what I'm saying, like you can't refer to something else that's talking about anything that Jesus did or said. I mean, we have like Tacitus and Josephus, but they're giving like very minimal information. The Gospels are like biographies, of his life. And so his argument is that the historical Jesus is different from the New Testament Jesus. And what he does what I get him to do is grant that, that the gospel writers view Jesus as divine and that Paul views Jesus as divine, which is key because typically like the scholarly consensus is that Paul's letters are actually written before the gospels. And so sometimes you'll hear this argument that Jesus's divinity developed from Mark to John because Mark's written first and then Matthew or Luke, and then John. But Paul is saying that Jesus is God even before all four books are written. which is really significant, right? And it's a significant part of the argument. And I quote Philippians 2 in it because Paul makes a decisive statement about Jesus's divinity in Philippians 2, that he shares the essence of God, and that he actually cut me off because he grants that that Paul views Jesus as divine, because he says that he has the name of God as well in Philippians 2. And so because of that, his argument is not actually an argument of did Jesus claim to be God? His argument is to undermine the historicity of the Gospels. Because he's acknowledging that they do show that Jesus is divine. He's just saying they're not true, and that the real Jesus never said that. It's just made up legend over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So where's this disconnect coming from the Jesus in which we read in the Gospels and the historical Jesus? Where are they different? Unpack that a little.
Yeah, I'm going to be 100% honest, and this is just my personal opinion, so don't take this to the bank. I think it's actually just a agenda to undermine Christianity in order to try to say it's not true. And why I say that is because if you can undermine even the claim that Jesus was God, so if you can undermine that claim, then you can like break it down before he even gets to the question, is Jesus really God? If that makes sense. It's like they're trying to take it down another level and go, no, we're not even arguing about what Jesus said. We're saying he never said it. And the reason why I think it's an agenda, because you have to go against all of the evidence that we have. The evidence that we have about what Jesus said is in the New Testament, and you don't have any competing evidence. So you basically, and this is what they're doing, they're basically just saying that's not true. And how they do it is they say, and this is true. This is like a good, in general, a good way to think about things historically. So what they'll say is the reason why John is unreliable and the things that Jesus said in John is because the less amount of corresponding attestation. I can't say the word attestation, whatever. Right. The less accounts you have of someone saying something, the less likely it is that they actually said it. So I bring up John 8:58 because of the context and the time that we have. And it's the clearest place where Jesus claims to be God, just off the general public knowledge. So that's why I go there. So what do? Instead of arguing it, because it's clear that Jesus is claiming to be God, and the reason why is in John 8:58, he says, before Abraham was, I am. And it's significant because in Exodus 3, when Moses asked God what his name is, he says, I am who I am, right? And even in the text, the people pick up stones to throw at Jesus, to stone him for blasphemy, for claiming to be God. It's like super clear. So what do you do about that? You have to say he didn't actually say that.
Interesting. So you lay out there that Jesus said that before Abraham was, I am. What is this I am? What does it mean?
Yeah. And so, right, it's the name of God, Yahweh, right, is how we're gonna is how we would say it. And really, like I said, if you go read Exodus 3:14, Moses is asking God, when I go to the Israelites in Egypt, because God, you're telling me that you're going to set them free. Who should I say sent me? And he's like, I am sent you. I am who I am, right? And so it's kind of this encompassing name. Like you can think about God, and it's like that's kind of what he just is, right? Like he is the foundation, the essence of ultimate reality. And there's even this kind of interesting sense of acknowledgement there. And so when Jesus is saying that in John 8, it is like, and it's a theme actually in the book of John. Jesus goes, I am the good shepherd, right? I am, he says, I am the door. He gives a bunch of I am statements throughout the book of John. And it's not, Like you just read the the opening of the book of John. The in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Like it's Jesus, and that's the point of John. And so maybe you're interested in, I'll ask this. You want to hear a little bit about if the conversation went on, where I would have taken it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so because his argument is um, the more the more accounts we have of somebody saying something, the more likely they are to say it. A better or I don't know if it's a better, but an argument to kind of, you know, object to that is actually Jesus before the council in Mark 14. And why is it significant is because what he says to them, he says in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So now you're combating this argument of, oh, well, you're saying that the more likely Jesus is quoted saying something, the more likely he said it. Well, here's a phrase that he says in 3 Gospels. He actually says it in two different places in the book of Matthew, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record Jesus before the high priest on the night before his resurrection, and they're asking him who he is, and he says that he's the Son of Man who will come riding on the clouds. And so there's 2 significant things that are happening there. The first is this idea. And if you watch it, my buddy Than actually goes into this and does a pretty good job. But even drawing this out is tough in a few minutes. But why is Jesus saying he's God there? Right. That's the question. Why? Like, what is that? Like to us, we would just be like, okay, like Son of Man riding on the clouds. Like, what is that? What does that even mean? And so I'll give my like 1 minute version. In the Old Testament, there is this motif of only deity riding on the clouds. So only we see Yahweh riding on the clouds, and then even in the Ugaritic text, we have a false god Baal, who's mentioned a lot in the Old Testament, who is known as the cloud rider as well. And kind of what's happening there is the Israelites are saying Baal is not the real God. Yahweh is. He's the one who actually rides on the clouds. And so Jesus, when he says, I'll ride on the clouds, to the Jews, they receive this as a divine statement because they understand only Yahweh rides on the clouds, right? And there's one other time in the Old Testament where someone rides on the clouds, and that's the Son of Man in Daniel 7, which Jesus is referencing. And where is he riding on the clouds to? To sit on the throne of God and have dominion over all things, which ties into kind of the second point. You could see on Jubilee, like this is hard, this would be difficult to lay something like this out. Right. But it leads in, you got any thoughts before leading to the second part?
No, please continue on.
Sweet. Which leads into the second part of this. And it's that the Old Testament actually has this tension that a lot of Jews they had a hard time dealing with. And it's another motif called the 2 powers in heaven motif. And it's this idea that there's actually 2 Yahwehs. And one of the times that it shows up most clearly is actually in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Genesis 19:24, it says that Yahweh rained down fire from Yahweh in heaven. I'm going straight off memory, so don't straight up quote me on that. But if you go read the text, what you'll read in English is the Lord sent fire from the Lord in heaven, which is we translate Yahweh as the Lord. Every time you see that in the Old Testament, it's the Lord. And so Old Testament Jewish guys are like, and gals, I'm sure, like, what's going on here? There's 2 Yahwehs in this passage, and it kind of created this proto-Trinitarian thing that they didn't know what to deal with. And then it shows up again in Daniel, this two Yahwehs. And we live in more of a full revelation of who God is. So it's easy for us in hindsight to connect. Oh yeah, we know who this second Yahweh is. It's Jesus, right? And so that's the argument that I would have fleshed out more with him. And it's a lot more difficult to deal with because Jesus said the statement multiple times, and then you have to start throwing in other interpretations of what did Jesus really mean there. But when you start digging in, you can see how in a very first century Jewish way, Jesus is claiming to be God that we may not pick up in a 21st century Western culture way.
Do you have any idea, obviously, it would just be speculation of what his potential response, or certainly an agnostic, atheist, scholarly response to that would be?
Yeah. If I had to take a guess, I would really be interested to see what anyone that is kind of take. I'd just be interested to see what anyone would take on the Genesis 19 thing, because it's straight up in there's no confusion about it. It's the Lord to the Lord. So I'd be really interested. I don't know what Alex's take would be on it. He'd probably try to maybe pull it down and go, no, Jesus is just claiming to be the Son of Man, the Messiah. And then you're kind of wrestling with this tension of, is the Messiah the Lord? Is he actually God? Right. And it's clear that the Jews, like I said, some wrestled with it, but they didn't have a clear understanding of it. And so like they, and this is what's difficult, or this maybe helps the skeptic if they're in an argument, but as the Christian, we kind of understand this. The Jews didn't have a full grasp of who the Messiah really was, right? They think he's just going to be this military conquest leader in the line of David that's going to make, Israel rule on the earth. And Jesus, the actual Messiah, comes and he just flips it on its head in so many different ways, right? One, he's claiming to be the Son of God. Two is it's actually an ushering of the new covenant, and his reign is actually much more spiritual on earth until he returns than it is literal and physical, right? And so he probably would take that approach. There is another argument that I've heard from some scholars. I don't know if you're interested in that one. Yeah, Alex probably doesn't. He could know this one, but there's a guy named Dan McClellan. If you've heard of him, he's I don't know. He's a biblical scholar. I think he's. I know he was in the Mormon Church, LDS. It's hard to tell if he doesn't talk about his personal beliefs. So it's hard to tell if he's like still a Mormon or not. But he has this thing that he calls the divine image bearer. And so what his claim would be is that the Lord basically endows Jesus to bear his name and his abilities, but he's not actually God himself. And he kind of makes this obscure reference back to the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, in which God says that his name is in him. And it's in Exodus. I can't remember exactly where. But if you go back and actually read the account of when Moses encounters God in the burning bush, there is an interesting thing happening where some of the text says that it's the Lord, and then some of the text says that it's the angel of the Lord, right? I think a very reasonable response is that the angel of the Lord is Jesus, right? Angel just means messenger, right? It doesn't have to be an angelic being. But the thing is about the argument is actually really clever in that it's an argument that basically grants that Jesus can do and say and claim anything that God does without actually being God. So it's a very clever argument because now no matter what you present, he just goes, well, yeah, because his name is in him. Of course he can forgive sins because the Lord can forgive sins, and he's letting him do that. Of course he says his name is I am because God let him do that. And I don't like the argument because it's you've boxed yourself in. Now there's nothing that I can say. It's kind of like Muslims say that Jesus wasn't crucified. It only appeared that he was crucified. So now there's nothing I can say to tell you why Jesus was crucified, because all they do is just go, no, it just appeared that way. Just look like it. It's like, oh, okay, sure. You know, and so it's a similar argument. I don't want to straw man his argument because he has a whole book about it and he's put a lot more work into it. I'm just trying to give it in simple terms. But yeah, there might be some pushback there.
If we think about it in the sense that you laid out that for first century Jewish people, it'd be very clear of his claims. But given the fact that this topic would be and has been debated for the centuries since, wouldn't have it been easier for Jesus just to say in clear, simple terms that I am God? Why all this cloak and dagger?
Yeah, I think there's actually some good reason for it. Bo Jackson has this great quote. You know who Bo Jackson is?
No.
Bo Jackson is like an American sports legend. He played in the MLB and the NFL, but his career got cut short due to injury. I'm pretty sure it's Bo Jackson that said this. Maybe it's Walter Payton, but I'm gonna go with Bo Jackson. He basically said, when you're good at something, you'll tell people that you're good at it, and when you're great at something, they'll tell you. And if Jesus was just going around saying that he was God explicitly all of the time, I think one, it would be blasphemy and he'd be put to death and he wouldn't actually be able to accomplish what he came to do. And the gospel writers actually make this clear. There's multiple times where Jesus is saying, don't tell anyone what I did. Like multiple times through the gospel, he's trying to hide his identity. And then the other is like, if anyone's walking around claiming to be God, who would believe them? Right? Like if you're just saying it. And so the reason why I bring up the Bo Jackson quote is because what's more important is not what Jesus says, it's what he does. Okay. I can go around claiming to be God. And then if somebody asks me to do something God-like and I'm incapable, well, what do my words matter? Right? It's my actions that are actually important. And so what we see in the book of Mark is in the intro, he quotes Isaiah and says, hey, there's one who's coming to prepare the way for Yahweh. And then he immediately goes into John the Baptist, preparing the way for Jesus. And then throughout the book of Mark, what Mark is going to do is show the things that Jesus did and why he's God. So Jesus walks on the water. Well, to the Old Testament Jews, who's the one who can walk on the water? Just Yahweh. He does it in Job 9. He's the one who can tread the seas, right? Jesus has the ability to calm the wind and the waves, right? Obviously, that seems like a godlike attribute just in general to be able to control the weather. But it's significant because in the Old Testament, it was the idea that the sea represented chaos, and the only one who had the power to bring order to chaos is Yahweh, right? He's the only one who could control the sea. So what does Jesus do? He looks at the wind and the waves. He says, hey, chill out, right? And it stops. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, right? Like, so you just see as you're working through the Gospels, he comes across the demon possessed man, and the demons recognize who he is, and he's like, "Stop, right? Don't say this about me." And so Alex, even in the argument, I just didn't get to press in on it. He said it in some different things where he tries to say, "Oh, Jesus was walking around claiming to be God." I don't think that he's doing it explicitly very often. I think the John 8:58 is a rare occurrence, that Jesus is not explicitly saying it all the time. He's implicitly doing things and implicitly saying it a lot, which I just think if you look at what's happening as a whole, makes a lot more sense. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
It's an interesting side note, actually, and it would be interesting to unpack sort of the Gospels and their background. So we know that Mark was written first, John was written last, Luke was a companion to Paul, and Matthew was written for a very Jewish audience. Could you give a bit more depth? Because that will be the sort of knowledge of the average churchgoer of that background, but there's no real depth. So you just laid out there why Mark was deliberately putting in certain instances to show. As a whole picture, you could just take one or you could take them all. Could you add more color and depth of the Gospels and their background?
I've been locked in on Mark lately, as you can tell. And so Luke, I mean, is an easy one, I guess, because he makes it clear in the intro who he's writing to. He's writing to the wise Theophilus. And so he's writing Luke and Acts to seemingly a person. And so this person was probably some type of someone who is in high authority, and for whatever reason, whether this person was already a Christian or maybe interested about the things of Jesus, Luke tells us that he's trying to put together an orderly account for Theophilus in order to get a good understanding of who Jesus was, the things that he did in his life, and then also just the growth of the early church. And so Luke is unique in that it's seemingly he's only writing to a person. And so Matthew is really cool. And, a lot of people, I think, would it seems to be that it's primarily to a Jewish audience because of how he is really portraying Jesus, fulfilling a lot of the Old Testament, right? So even Matthew, if my memory serves me correctly, he talks about Jesus going to Egypt, right? So you have like the flight to Egypt and coming out of it, right? Well, what did the people of Israel do? They were in Egypt. They come out. Matthew's not the only one to include this, but just the temptation of Jesus for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness is significant because there's some connection there to the Jews being in the wilderness for 40 years and failing. Right, they give in to temptation in the wilderness, and so Matthew is in a lot of ways depicting Jesus as the true Israel. And so you can kind of see some context to just a Jewish audience there. And then, John is unique, and you can see why some people would question John, because it's not like the synoptic gospels. But if it really is written by John, then it doesn't have to be, because he was there and he can give his own account of what happened. And if you notice, what John does is actually provide a lot more dialogue. And I think that's interesting about John. The last quarter to a third of it is just the last week of Jesus's life and all the things that he's teaching his disciples. So that's why you have a lot more dialogue from Jesus and the things that he said. And so that's why, I think it's a little bit disingenuous to discredit John simply because it's different, because clearly the author of John has a different goal in what he's trying to communicate. And it's not just about this idea of making Jesus look more divine. It's not even in that way, but simply in just providing more dialogue and what he taught his disciples and in kind of interpersonal interactions that he had, with people, whether it's Nicodemus or the woman at the well, or things like that. And so, and then, you get into Paul's writings. Paul is, in his ministry, he is everywhere he goes as he's looking to plant churches. He goes to the synagogues first in the city, and he tries to reason and preach to the Jews there. And then if they reject him, he goes to the Gentiles. And just the way things happen is, a lot of the Gentiles come to Christ, the non-Jewish people. And so the majority of his letters are not written to Jews. They are written to churches that do have Jews and Christians in it. You can tell that that's the case. But because of the Jews and Gentiles, both Christians, but Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, because that's the case, there's a lot more of just talking to Gentiles, which is probably why, as 21st century readers, we like Paul's letters a lot, because they're easy they're to the point. You don't got to dive into the Old Testament as much. He's still going to quote the Old Testament, don't get me wrong, but yeah. So you put me on the spot there. There's my general insight on some of the Gospels and Paul.
Put you on the spot, but I thought you did rather valiantly.
Okay.
Actually added a lot of context behind the Gospels. To swing from one big topic to the next, one thing that came up in the Jubilee debate was the issue of suffering.
Yeah.
And the axis, as it were, of the argument was about animal suffering, how that plays a role, given the fact that we might, through theology and philosophy, be able to reason human suffering, but there's animal suffering is set apart. The example of the deer caught under a tree, breaking its leg, and then it's going to spend for the next week in confused agony until it's either eaten alive or dies through thirst and hunger. Where do you think the issue of suffering, and as a sub-argument, animal suffering, fits into the whole picture?
That's a great question. I'll first reference my buddy Tim. He argues in the Jubilee video, and he brings up what's called the axiological mismatch problem. And you're going to have to take your own deep dive into that. I'm not getting into that on this on this podcast. But what he's doing philosophically is saying that if, in order to kind of make this take, that because animal suffering exists, God must not be real. There's a problem in asserting a certain value theory that may or may not be true. And so anyone can go dive into that. I think it's a really good argument, but that's more than this podcast. I think for me, there's really, I think, a couple things to consider, right? And I'll just give my personal opinion on this. Listen, I'm from Texas. Like, we hunt, we have guns, like, we shoot animals, and so there's a part of it where it's just like, I kind of want to question, do we really care as human beings? So the majority of us really care that animals die? Like, I just like so that like could it not be that it's okay that they're born, they live their lives, and they're a part of this ecosystem that God has set up, and in that, the predator eats the prey. You have the grass that provides nutrition for the gazelle, and then you have the gazelle that provides nutrition for the lion. And it actually creates this ecosystem that is very actually effective in environments, right? And it's like not morally wrong for the lion to eat the gazelle. It's not a morally wrong thing. If you're a meat eater, you do the same thing. Like, you're the predator. We just don't have to go out and we developed, weapons, and then we're smart enough to develop systems. We don't use our teeth and claws, right? Like, we don't have to do that. But it doesn't make it any less immoral for a lion to eat a gazelle. So there's like that sense, right? And then we live in a world where people and animals die of accidents. And I think my pushback question would be, so there's like, So that means I shouldn't believe that Christianity is true. Like that's kind of my like what like I'm not going to believe that Christianity is true because an animal accidentally dies somewhere. But I understand Alex's argument because he's simply going, it's more likely that animals would randomly die in a world that's just kind of materialized and evolution has occurred than in a world where a loving God exists, right? Why would a loving God allow a random accident to happen for an animal to randomly suffer? And I'll say two things to that. One is, I think in some ways, I'm actually comfortable with just saying, I don't know. Like, I notice when I push on atheist and agnostic on their beliefs, when I get them to a place that they don't have an answer for, they feel comfortable appealing to agnosticism. Just go, well, I don't know. And it's just like, well, why can't I do the same in my worldview? Like I got to have the answer for every nook and cranny. I have to have the answer for why a deer randomly died. Like, I don't know. Like why? Like that's not sufficient enough. But if I was going to give a biblical answer, it would be that the gospel is actually for the redemption of all of creation, not just humanity. So in Colossians 1, we see that God is reconciling the world back to himself, and it's all things, whether in heaven and on earth. All things are being reconciled back to God. And in that reconciliation, I think it's Isaiah, he talks about this idea of like the lion and the lamb they'll be together. They'll graze together, right? Like the child will be able to go in the snake's den and won't get bit. And there's this picture of harmony and unity amongst species. So there's this like answer of like, even the redemption of animals is coming. Even their suffering, even the random accidental suffering, or the gazelle being eaten by the lion. I don't even know if lions eat gazelles, but whatever. And then you have in Romans 8, where Paul just acknowledges there as well that all of creation is waiting for the redemption that is coming in Christ. All of creation, because they too kind of feel just the suffering and the angst of this world. And so there's kind of my thoughts on it. It's hard for me because it's not personally, it's not a hiccup for me personally that animals suffer. And maybe, like I said, maybe it's because I grew up hunting and stuff. Like, I don't know. So, yeah.
It's certainly quite a modern
Yeah.
debating strategy, as it were, because if you think anything from antiquity to even like 50 years ago, the idea of there been any trauma from animals dying would just be completely alien.
Yeah.
No, but I thought that's quite an interesting, certainly from the Colossian side, the harmony and the reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what your thoughts are on apologetics versus evangelism. So I was speaking to this guy earlier this week, actually. It'll be the episode probably before yours. And he was saying that we need less apologists and more evangelists.
Yeah.
Because everyone likes to self-style themselves as apologists. And they're quite feisty. And the church does need its defenders, but it doesn't need defending because it's been defending itself for 2,000 years. And we actually need more people to go into all nations and disciple. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Because you kind of would definitely fall into this sort of apologist camp.
Yeah.
Very, forward, public-facing, debating.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think this guy's 100% right. Not that we like reject apologetics. I mentioned I did college ministry for 6.5 years. I mean, like my whole mantra in just my actual life is evangelism and discipleship. Right. Apologetics they're important and they're a thing, and there is discernment when I'm having an actual conversation with somebody on when to give an apologetic and then when to evangelize. right? Um, but I'm having a conversation with the security guard at our church a couple weeks ago, and she's really wrestling with her faith and where she's at. And I'm if she asks a hard question, I might give an apologetic, but my purpose and focus is evangelizing. I'm sharing my faith. I'm getting to the gospel of um, of Jesus and how he provides hope and salvation for her. And the ministry that I was a part of, it was 90% of my time was going to the college campus, building relationships, and sharing my faith. Right. That's all. That's like all I was doing. And I saw a lot of guys come to Christ, and just in our ministry, a lot of girls as well. One semester, this is like one of the craziest things I've ever experienced, but one semester we had like 40 people come to Christ in a month. And, some people, maybe 40 people like raise their hand at like a revival or something. No, this was 40 people day after day, just in the dorms, in the cafeterias of either me or one of my coworkers or another student, just sharing their faith with another person across a table, over a meal, over a cup of coffee, and people coming to Christ. And so, yeah, there is a clear distinction between apologetics and evangelism. I think there's discernment on when they need to take place. So I give you like a small example. I don't share my testimony in apologetics. Anecdote is not good evidence for apologetics. I share my testimony all the time when evangelizing and how God has impacted my life personally and how he can do the same for that person. Right. And then like I said, I'm a youth pastor. I mean, in the last month, handful of students, I've met up with them. It's like, I'm sharing my faith with them. I don't know. I can't tell quite where they're at with the Lord. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share the gospel with them. I'm not going to go into animal suffering or the reliability of the gospels or something like that. Yeah, it's evangelism and discipleship is the movement of the church. Yeah. And apologetics, plays its part, but.
So evangelism and discipleship, what else can we expect from you in the coming future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm expanding my social media presence. I've mainly been on TikTok. I don't know where that's going to go, and so I've shifted to start posting on Instagram and YouTube as well. I had this incredible experience on Jubilee, and that's opened some doors, and so I do want to continue to press on in terms of just an online presence. But for me, that's just a portion of my life. And in particularly, people say that they do like ministry online and like, that's cool and whatever, but that's never going to be my primary ministry. It's always going to be in the context of my local church. And, I had a moment recently where I really thought this is my last ministry job. I'm going to go out in the corporate world and I'm going to just evangelize there and things like that. But I really had a moment with God recently, just kind of like middle of the night, can't sleep, and felt affirmed that nope, he wants to keep me in full-time ministry. And so I'm really kind of looking out ahead in the next couple of years and probably taking a different position or role in a church somewhere. Yeah, so I don't know what it'll look like, but
it's interesting you draw the emphasis there on your ministry work when focused within the local church. Why is that? Because you think, oh, well, come on, Coley, you could make a really good TikTok and reach hundreds of thousands of people. Surely you can only reach on a really good month, a couple hundred.
Yeah, I just think that's the way that God is actually designed and purposed his people is to be the church, and to love your fellow believers and minister to them, but also being a light in just our local communities, and reaching out to our friends, our neighbors, loving them, serving them, sharing with them the hope of the gospel. Jesus, even so, Jesus doesn't call us to even make converts. He calls us to make disciples. And I just don't know how I can truly make a disciple on my online presence. Like, I've got some high school guys that it's like I'm discipling, and I've seen their growth over the past most of these guys are juniors now. So I've seen their growth over the past 3 years in their faith. And that's what's like really bearing fruit in my life. And, I get to know their parents, and be a blessing to their families. And so, just the amazing idea of like, they're going to get married one day, they're going to have kids, like the blessing of just them knowing Jesus in their life and following them, and how that will bear fruit out into the world is awesome.
Amazing. Well, all the best, Coley, on your mission. Your links will be in the show description for people to check you out. Thank you very much for your time for coming on.
Absolutely. Dude, I appreciate it. Joe, so good to meet you, man. Thanks for having me on.